Call to order this governing board workshop to review the district's achievement plan for Tuesday, January 13th, 2026. Our roll call, Tony Henry, Lori Grant, Susan Collins,
Boyd Hardy.
and we have a quorum, and so we will turn it over to Dr. Warner and her team.
President Henry, members of the board, thank you for attending the KOSD academic workshop, where we want to share the focus that we have on setting our vision, goals, and guardrails around learning outcomes. Seemed like an appropriate time mid-year to take a look at what our goals are, where we're headed, and how we measure our journey along the way. So the goal is just to share, even though you've been on the board for a while, just to recommit to our standards, our curriculum, our assessment plan, and how we measure student progress. So you'll hear a lot from Director Liz Allen today, who will share the majority of the information.
Welcome everybody, President Henry, members of the board, and the public. Thank you all for being here for today's academic workshop. Our goals, again, are to provide you with information about the district assessment plan, which includes our academic standards, KUSD's curriculum, and also our plan for professional learning communities at our schools. You have a couple of resources in front of you underneath of your agenda. You have a copy of the PowerPoint, a copy of our curriculum adoption process, and then two staple packets. One is the curriculum handbook and assessment plan. This is actually accessible on the KUSD website on the curriculum and assessment page. And then also you have a copy of our resource that is shared with our district educators for professional learning communities. So you should have all of those in front of you. So as we go through the presentation, please feel free to stop me, ask any clarifying questions as we go. It's the middle one, right?
Yeah. Is it?
Okay, there we go. So we always start everything with our mission that KUSD welcomes all students on a pathway to informed and engaged citizenship. Obviously, curriculum is integral to this because it exposes students to the pathway so they can learn about what lies ahead of them. And then assessment also plays a major factor in that it helps students and educators to measure their progress on their pathway. So altogether, the KUSD team works on helping students identify pathways and adjust them as they move forward. The Arizona Academic Standards, just a reminder, these are the knowledge and the understanding and skills that are identified at the state level that students are expected to learn, and we are expected to effectively teach, so students are ready to move on to college, career, or military service. Again, they're developed and revised by the Academic Standards team at ADE, and the State Board of Education adopts them. The academic standards are available to everybody on the ADE website under the standards. The website's listed here on this slide, but it's the tab that says standards under it. KUSD ensures that Arizona Academic Standards guide instruction by providing KUSD board adopted curriculum and evaluating students using standards-based assessments, which we will talk more about both of those things. And then also monitoring and adjusting instruction using results from the standards-based assessments. So all the assessments we do throughout the year are based in the Arizona Academic Standards. This slide is very tiny, but you also have, this is a copy of the very top part of our curriculum adoption procedure. This is something that we go through frequently. We've had this on several of our board agendas that the curriculum department will, when we find out that there's curriculum that needs to be adopted, there's two different avenues it can take. One would be a core curriculum, and then the other would be supplemental. This process that's highlighted on the screen is our core curriculum adoption. So when we find out that a new curriculum needs to be adopted, and I say find out, but it means that if standards were to be changed, or if we find that the curriculum is not meeting our needs, or we just need to review our curriculum to make sure it's up to date, the curriculum department will look at requirements from ADE, we'll look at Arizona academic standards alignment, and also the overall cost to make sure it fits in with our district budgets. Once we identify curriculum that meets those needs, it could be one or two, though we'll be identifying a curriculum that could be piloted. We'll do that, we'll present it to educators so that they have input on the review and selection process. Once we've identified curriculum, we will contact schools to ask for volunteers to pilot. And the piloting process can last between 1 to 2 semesters, although we have had it extend even longer because we needed some more experience with the curriculum before moving forward with adoption. We will get input from piloting teachers, and we'll look at any data that they have related to that curriculum to evaluate whether or not it's effective. And we'll kind of track that throughout the pilot. At the end of the pilot, there's an open forum with educators, if we have pilot teachers and non-pilot teachers. We'll all meet together and review the pros and cons of that piloted curriculum. And then teachers will vote to determine if that piloted curriculum should go to the curriculum committee. And that is the committee that makes a recommendation whether or not to bring the curriculum to the governing board, which is the process that you've been a part of frequently. On this handout, the curriculum adoption process, it does go on to explain the public review process, which is everything is put on display for 60 days. Well, it's brought to the school board and then put on display for 60 days before the school board makes a vote whether or not it should be approved as a district adopted curriculum. But I want to emphasize the point that any curriculum that's adopted we do ensure its alignment to the Arizona state standards, because that is what our students are measured on at the end of each school year. We also, a lot of times curriculum companies will provide a crosswalk of their curriculum with the Arizona state standards. So we do review that, but we do rely on our educators' experience with the curriculum as well to ensure that it's not just a sales pitch that we're receiving from a curriculum company, but that the experience the teachers are experiencing, it really does align with Arizona standards. And that's data that we'll collect throughout the pilot. Here's some more tiny print, but again, this is the public review process that I outlined there. The curriculum committee is composed of members from the superintendent's cabinet, 1 to 2 representatives. The curriculum department also has 1 to 2 representatives. We'll have KUSD educators, 2 to 3 representatives, members of the public, 2 members of those, and then we also are always looking for high school students to be part of that, just part of that learning pathway to inform and engage citizenship. This is a way they can get involved with their community and their school district and really make an impact in the education.
Mm-hmm.
So that committee meets. We do have regularly scheduled meetings throughout the year. However, if we don't have curriculum that needs to be reviewed, that we don't hold the meetings. Just as a foreshadowing, we will have several coming up over the next several months, and you will see some curriculum coming to the board for approval, because we have been piloting a few different things this school year. So the curriculum committee will review the data from the pilots and will vote whether or not to take it to the governing board to put on display and then possible approval. And then it goes to the 60 days that I mentioned earlier. Any questions about that process?
Just out of curiosity, after the piloting process, has any curriculum ever come to a board that was denied? And if so, has there ever been a thought to have a curriculum, a potentially piloted curriculum pre-approved to help avoid that if educators really like it? Just curious if that's something that's ever happened.
In my experience, I have not experienced that, but it's not very long that I've been in this, it's 2 or 3 years I've been in this position, so I don't know if historically you've experienced that a curriculum has not been. We try to do our due diligence prior to it coming to the KUSD board, but that could happen, and we would need to have a backup plan ready to go should it happen. This adoption cycle just gives you an outline of the grade level and subject area, and it's actually included in the curriculum handbook and assessment plan. You can see it up close. It shows the year, or the grade level and the subject area, and then the curriculum that was adopted and when it was last adopted. You'll see some on there that are pretty old. So that is definitely on our radar to work on, because they are not aligned to the current standards, as those were, especially the core standards, the English, math, science, and social studies have all been revised within the last 8 to 9 years. So we'll be looking at high school science for the coming year, and then history is also pretty old, high school history. I do have on this chart as well the next year that the curriculum will be piloted and when it's scheduled to be adopted next. So again, all of this information is in the curriculum handbook and assessment plan, which is on the KUSD website.
And we want to make with the exception of if there was a sudden change in state standards, we did have that occur with science and English language arts in the past, and it couldn't follow the cycle, so that would preempt it. We would now suddenly need to switch to align this. So
Yeah.
it's this unless ADE or the state board changes the standards. Significantly.
Or if we find that what we have is meeting the needs, then we would not need to go through the pilot and adoption process. Any new curriculum is going to have a cost attached to it, so we want to make sure that we're being fiscally responsible as well. So if it doesn't need to be replaced, then so that's a brief overview of the standards, the curriculum adoption process, and so we'll move on to assessments unless you have any other questions about standards or curriculum.
I do have a curriculum question. What do we do, like when we replace a curriculum, what is the general practice for the previously used curriculum, particularly if the standards are outdated? What do we do with those materials?
So statute says that the curriculum we collect it, and then we either dispose of it or store it, and it should not be back out in the schools again. That's the plan. Yeah, that's the plan. So we're going to move into assessment, and there is a continuum of assessment that starts with formative assessment, it moves to benchmark assessments, and then summative assessments, and they all feed into each other. They start with more informal types of assessment and become more formal as we progress across the types of assessments. So formative assessments are checks for understanding or common formative assessments, and those are things that checks for understanding are what happen in the classroom while teaching is occurring. Teachers will ask for understanding from students, and it's really, the goal is to make students' thinking visible. We'll talk about covert versus overt assessments. So the covert is what's happening inside of their brains. They might be asked to think about something, but then we ask them to give an overt response, so they're actually explaining it to teachers to make the learning or their thinking visible. And that's really crucial for teachers to understand students' mastery of standards, so they can understand if students have a misconception or if they need to do some reteaching. So I would say checks for understanding are the most informal type of assessment, and then we move into common formative assessments, and those are typically assessments that educators agree on to assess the standards. And then will meet in professional learning committees, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to discuss the results. So it could be a team of teachers that are teaching the same subject, they give the same assessment, and then they can talk about which students did really well, and were there certain strategies that that teacher implemented that other teachers can also use in their classrooms. Sometimes we'll have teachers, or students will move between classrooms to have instruction from different teachers just to change things up, because sometimes you might learn something differently or just have a better understanding hearing it from somebody else. So it's not always the same person. And you'll hear a little bit more about that as we move forward, how that works in schools. And the goal of the formative assessment is to get an idea of students mastering the standards before we get to the benchmarks. And benchmarks are assessments that are administered at regular intervals throughout the school year. There's a testing window that's set by the district that everybody in the district is testing at that time, and it is the same for everybody. In K-8, we tested reading and math on our iReady, which is a curriculum component, but also has an assessment. So students will take the iReady diagnostic in K-8, and then high school students in grades 9 through 11 take an ACT practice assessment. And that is because our high school state assessment is the ACT. And there's research from ACT that shows the more students are exposed to the ACT, the better they are going to do. It kind of naturally makes sense that if you're a little bit familiar with that assessment, you're going to do better. So the benchmark assessments are administered 3 to 4 times throughout the school year, and they are, once the data is received, schools will review it and identify standards that students need to, or that students have done really well on, and standards that students need more growth or more work in, and they'll make a plan for instruction moving forward. Then finally is the summative assessment, and these are the assessments given towards the end of the school year. It's typically an April test window. There's several listed here. We have AASA, AZ Science, and ACT. Those are the core academic assessments that are given in grades 3 through 11. We have AZELA, MSAA, TSA, and Cambridge assessments as well, but I'll explain that just a little bit, a couple more slides. But basically, these are the summative assessments that are mandated by the state of Arizona to determine student mastery of standards. And this is what we're building towards all school year long, is the performance on the summative assessments. Just looking at my notes to make sure I've covered everything I wanted to say here. Yeah, the biggest thing is that the summative assessments tell us, like I said, if students have mastered the standards, but then those results are also used to calculate school letter grades. And they do look at both proficiency and growth. Each of those is a certain percentage of the school letter grade. It varies from grade level span. So schools that serve grades K-5 have a different percentage versus, well, no, that's not true. Grades K through 8 have a different percentage than high school does. So it varies, the growth and the mastery. And so mastery would be, did the students learn the assessments? And growth is, did students grow from the prior year? So they're comparing the results from the year before to how they did this year on the assessments. So, and schools receive points for both components. Any questions on those?
What is the number of testing days to instructional days per section? So before, like the fall break, between fall break and winter break to spring break, and then spring break to end of year?
There is a testing window, a benchmark assessment window right at the beginning of the school year. So it's like every assessment window for the benchmarks is about 2 weeks long, but that does not mean students are testing for 2 weeks. That just means that we have 2 weeks to complete the assessment. We encourage students to get for schools to get their students tested the first day or two of that assessment window, and then the rest of it should be used for makeup assessments. So really, if we're talking actual student days testing, it would be 1 to 2 days in that first quarter when we first come back in the summer. In the second quarter, the next assessment window is not until December. And it's the same thing, it would be 1 to 2 testing days per student in December. And then the next assessment window is right before we go to spring break, same format. And then when we come back from spring break, it's testing basically from spring break till the end of April. But again, students are not testing that. One student is not testing that entire time. They are doing AZ size, could be 1 to 3 days depending on the testing format. AASA is again 1 to 3. Well, that one would be 3 days, possibly 5 depending on how schools decide to test. ACT is 1 day. Azella is 1 day. Yeah. Most of these, if we're talking actual days students are testing, it's 1 to 2 days. But throughout the year, if we're calculating, it would be 2, 4, 6, maybe 10 days of testing per student.
Whole days or parts of
Parts of days.
And then does that vary based on the grade?
Yes. Yeah. Because the ASA has 3 parts, 3 subjects it's testing. It's got a writing test, a reading test, and a math test. The writing test is one component that cannot be completed on any of the other test days. Reading has 2 components and math has 2 components. And those, you can test 2 reading or 2 math on the same day. So, or a school could determine they want to just give 1 section a day, and it could end up being 5 total days of testing for the ASA.
And I know that I asked last year that a lot of the assessments are required by the state.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any way that we can merge it so that they hit multiple requirements, but it's less testing so that there's more instruction?
If we could, we would. We really do try to minimize the amount of assessments. The benchmark assessments have multiple reasons for testing.
So for the benchmark testing, it may be driven by school improvement if a school's identified for federal improvement. It is mandated by the state of Arizona for K-3 for, they have to report on their advance in literacy. So some of these, Azella, which is only for EL students, there's federal and state mandates of it needs to be done an initial test for placement, and then after that it just needs a reassessment at the end of the year. So we would love to move some of those, and we did reduce as many as we can, but some of them are driven by legislation or regulations.
Yeah. Tied to funding, basically.
Tied to funding and meeting the state statute.
So what is the turnaround time between when the benchmarks are administered and when the teachers get the data?
Immediate. They have it immediate.
Okay, and then like how much teaching time do they have to implement what they learned from that data before the next benchmark?
So the first one's given in July, and the second one's given in December.
Okay.
So it's several months, that for first semester basically.
Mhm.
And then the third assessment is given in February. So it's it's a shorter window. It goes from it's all of January and most of February before the third assessment. And I should mention that we do administer a 4th benchmark in May to K-8 students. So they do have the state assessments in April, and then they do take another benchmark in May, but that is part of a requirement for the federal and grants requirements.
I wish people that didn't work with kids didn't make rules about testing.
Yeah, testing, yes.
I got one quick question. You said, is this all encompassing, like iReady is part of these assessments and stuff like that? Because my daughter just finished winter break, and the first week back, they did iReady. How come that's not done before versus where they have 2 weeks off of just mind-numbing nothing? I'm just curious who sets these schedules, but that's what she walked into. And that's what all these kids are walking into. So why is it, you kept saying it's December, that was January 4th that she walked into these states. So how come I feel like we're putting the kids behind the 8 ball? Hey, you had 2 weeks to nothing, now you gotta test these benchmarks. Why is that?
I'm just curious on the iReady benchmark in January, because we do it in December. So Lisa, can you come up to, we have Lisa Sipe here, she's our assessment coordinator. I do know that we do have a Move On When Reading Early Literacy report due February 1st. And I'll
I'm
let you take it.
assuming your daughter is at White Cliffs?
Yeah,
Okay, White Cliffs is on a different assessment calendar than the rest of the district. They requested it to test it out because they felt like if they tested their students at the beginning of each quarter, they would have a whole quarter to work on the data and the knowledge. So that's the only school that tested when they returned, and that was set up with their school principal.
and is that something that's proven beneficial or detrimental?
That's what they want to see.
How long has this been going on?
This is the first year,
This is the first, okay, great, thank you for the answer.
because they just wanted data quicker so they can work on it the whole semester. Because they feel like when they would take the benchmark at the end of February, it was too close to state testing. They didn't have enough time to work on the skills or standards that the students needed help.
So if all the kids that do it then in December, are they doing it to prepare for the following semester?
The December one is their second one. White Cliff's second one was when they returned for second quarter. So White Cliffs is the only school taking it at the beginning of each quarter.
All the other ones taken at the end of the quarter, so I'm a little confused on.
The rest of the district starts in when school starts, which
Correct.
is July. 2-week window, and now we've narrowed it down to 4 days with makeups. The second benchmark, we wait until the end of December so we can see the growth over the whole semester. The third one is at the end of February because we need it for the Move On When Reading K-3 Literacy Grant for reporting purposes. And then the fourth one is also K-3 Literacy Move On When Reading, but it also serves as a placement for our middle school students going on to high school so they know which classes to appropriately put them in.
So what is White Cliff's schedule?
White Cliffs is the only one that comes in there at the beginning of each quarter, but their fourth quarter one, the May one, will be in May with everybody else because beginning of the quarter is state testing.
So they do it in October instead of December, and January.
Instead of end of February.
So their first one is when?
July.
The first one is July. Because I'm just trying to wrap my mind, it almost sounds like they're doing it early, then doing it late, then doing it early, then doing it late. Is that what I'm to understand with White
They're
Cliffs?
doing it earlier than the rest of the district.
But I'm just, okay, so they don't do a December one. And December is to prove that they did everything they were supposed to up to December. So then my question is that January one that White Cliffs does, is that to prove they did everything they were supposed to up to December?
They're doing it for the purpose of, they want to know where their students are at the beginning of the quarter so they can plan appropriately for that whole quarter and get the biggest bang for their buck before state testing.
So they're doing theirs as a projection forward rather than a reflection back.
And that's just, it seems kind of weird because in my mind, you want to test them when they're fresh, they know the knowledge, they do it. How is it, I mean, to say it's a projection backwards versus a projection future, I mean, it's what it is. They look at their testing and say, hey, this is where they did well, this is where they need to improve. Why would December change that from January? Why would 2 weeks off? That's why, I'm just genuinely curious. I don't understand why White Cliffs is thinking just 2 weeks will
We'll
help.
have the
For us-
principal of White Cliffs.
Okay.
So for us, we wanted to start, that October one was a big one for us, to drive that second semester. So we take it at the beginning of the year, like normal, then we take it at the start of second quarter and plan our intervention groups and what we're doing in lessons based around how they did doing on that one. Then going into January, we do the same thing. So for us, it's been, we wanted to see by starting it out fresh and driving that intervention and instruction at the start of it, would we see a difference within our scores?
And this is the first year you're doing this?
This is the first year.
Okay, okay. And the teachers seem like, has there been any?
Teachers have wanted
comments
to
on it?
try this. There's been a conversation for years, like, would this be, I mean, it's hit and miss, which teachers want to, but we have had strong support from our staff.
Okay, and how does the preliminary?
Preliminary,
Okay, go
what I'm seeing from a January to December, I am seeing, it's a lot aligning, where if we had taken December, we're still seeing our January results the same. The biggest difference for us was that October one and being able to drive that intervention. But we are starting to see some growth. What that's going to look like at the end, we're excited to see.
Cool. Thank you. And thank you.
Yeah, great, that's great questions, that's exactly why we're here, is to have this dialogue. And part of what we want to do as a district team is to work with our principals to look at what their staffs are doing, and we encourage in the PLCs and at the district leadership level to be, to have hypothesis and to be research-based thinkers. And so what you're saying is absolutely appropriate. Why not when it's freshly learned versus waiting? But that's what we've encouraged them to do, is to look at historical data and current data and see what's best. So you raise a good question, and we appreciate you piloting that.
Thank you, boy, we don't have students, so we wouldn't know the difference.
Yeah. That was, and then when you kept referencing.
They may say,
it's not
"Yes,
as
we
soft."
heard."
Yeah.
Or they may say, everybody get on board.
Any other questions? Thank you. So, in preparation for this, we did send out a survey to schools, school leaderships to get, our leadership teams to get information about how they're currently using formative assessments, and this is just a summary of those responses. That the type of assessments that are happening are class discussions, so teachers can evaluate what students are learning. Checks for understanding, as I mentioned earlier, exit tickets, and that will be something where a teacher will ask a question about the lesson that day and collect that data as students walk out the door, and then use that to analyze and prepare for the next lesson. Assignments that our students are doing, either in class or outside of class, and then common assessments, which I mentioned earlier about teachers evaluating. The frequency of those assessments happen daily. If they're informal checks, that's happening during the instruction. There are weekly assessments that are the formative assessments, and then also monthly would be, if there's a power standard, that would be a standard that is highly tested on one of our state assessments. Those would be assessed monthly. The purpose of those are to, in order for teachers to adjust their instruction and their pacing. They can reteach during class time and then also during intervention time that's scheduled at the schools. They group students for support and enrichment, so depending on how students do on that assessment, they know these students need a certain skill, and these students maybe need a different skill, and then maybe need some enrichment. So they can really group students based on that assessment data. And also the data is used to determine if students are meeting their goals and is part of the special education process.
Can I jump in just quickly?
Of course.
There's always there's a saying in education, if you're I don't know if it's a bumper sticker saying, but we always like to say, if you're formatively assessing your students on a regular basis, then your benchmarks and your summatives should not be a surprise. Mm-hmm. So while benchmarks and summatives are required, formatives are really where it is, an interactive, engaging classroom, which is what we think our principals and our teachers are doing. Gives us the best value, the best data value, honestly. And so we're always excited to hear the principal's report, and she'll talk about PLCs in a minute, how much our formative assessments tell us about what we're doing. So.
And that is part of the data review, is that individual teachers will look at their data, but then also it'll come up in professional learning communities, which we'll talk about a little bit. I also would like to mention the 3 tiers of support that are a common model in schools. That tier 1 is the basic classroom instruction. That's tier 1 instruction with the core curriculum. Typically 80% of students should master the concepts during that tier 1 instruction. Students who don't master it in tier 1 move on to tier 2 instruction, and those would be those interventions. So that's should be about 15% of students should be responding to those interventions. And if there are still students who are not responding to interventions, they move into tier 3, and that's intended for like about 5% of students. And those are typically students that have learning disabilities, or could be English learners, and they just need some more intensive instruction outside of the tier 1 and tier 2. And so formative assessments really drive these groupings. A lot of schools will have RTI time, or response to intervention time, they'll have win time, which stands for what I need, and so they rely on that assessment data to put students into these groups. So once the benchmarks are given, this is the process. Again, we got this information directly from school leadership teams about how benchmark assessments are used. So the first step is to review it. So they're looking at all of the data and kind of aggregating it, looking for trends, and just summarizing it, maybe comparing it to the prior assessment or even the prior year's assessment that was given at the same time. So once they've got a good idea of what the data is telling them, then they spend time reflecting on it. So identifying what the root cause is, why did students perform the way that they did, what instruction was happening, and then identify possible changes to that instruction. After they've reflected on it and come up with some root cause of the data or of the results, then they move on to the response, which would be teachers will conference with students to set goals specifically for the next benchmark. They will reteach the core instruction, adjust their groupings, the tier 2 and tier 3 groups, and also provide targeted interventions. And then it's a constant monitoring process, so it's just, we're never stopping, we're constantly assessing, just trying to make sure that students are mastering the standards and then tracking progress until the next benchmark. Summative assessments, we've talked quite a bit about them already, but this is just a breakdown of each of the assessments and what their implications are for us. So the Azella test is administered to English learners, and those students can be reclassified. Their English learner status can be reclassified to proficient depending on how they do on that assessment. And schools earn points based on students who test proficient in English. The AZSI is obviously a science assessment. It's administered to grades 5, 8, and 11, and schools earn bonus points based on their school's proficiency compared to the state's proficiency. AASA and MSAA are the core, so reading and math assessments for grades 3 through 8. MSAA is for students, exceptional students that do not take the traditional AASA state assessment. And again, this is a bulk of the school letter grade. It's both proficiency and growth on these assessments for grades, for schools that are, that serve grades K through 8. And then ACT and MSAA is the proficiency and growth assessment for high schools. And it is most of the school letter grade for a traditional high school. We do have an alternative high school that ACT and MSAA has a component, but it's not as large as our traditional high schools. We also give Cambridge assessments, which are typically through the month of May and into June, and those we use this to determine the efficacy of our Cambridge courses. They contribute to high school CCRI points, which is a whole nother workshop that we should probably do. I love it, but and then TSA is the assessment. It stands for Technical Skills Assessment, and that is the assessment given to CTE students at the end of their CTE progression of classes. And that, again, determines the efficacy of CTE, high school CTE programs. Also, the students' results on that contribute to CCRI points. So this is an overview of all the assessments, the summative assessments that we give and how they contribute to school letter grades, which takes us to school improvement, because depending on how students do on, depending on how schools do on the state assessments, determine whether or not they are in improvement or not. And then I'd ask Shelley to talk a little bit about that. So it's her specialty.
So, federal regulations, U.S. Department of Education, they look at test scores over a 3-year span, and specifically at subgroups. And those subgroups are going to be like racial identification, how are they identified by race, whether or not they receive special education services, if they're an English learner, or if they're in a low income category, that they show that they're either a level 1 or level 2. We used to call them free and reduced lunch. well, now we just say low income. So those are what they consider subgroups. And so the misnomer is typically, if you get an A letter grade or a B letter grade, that you're wonderful, but you can still be in federal improvement, because letter grades look at the school as a whole on how they did from the previous year. How many are proficient this year, and what kind of growth did they have from the previous year? Federal is looking at just a subgroup. So they will look at every individual subgroup, and they're going to look at how they've been doing over 3 years. So if a school is doing amazing with all their students, but their special education students are just stagnant, they're going to be identified as a federal school of improvement. And they use the Azella results, the ASA, the ACT, the MSA. They take the state assessments that we give. The 3 categories are growth, proficiency, and chronic absenteeism. So the first column is TSI. If a school has any one of those subgroups that has shown a regression or stagnation in one of those 3 areas or 2 of those areas, they're considered a TSI, which means they're a targeted school improvement. So a specific subgroup is targeted to show improvement, and they're an improvement for 3 years. If they are showing stagnation in all 3 areas, that's chronic absenteeism, growth, and proficiency, then they're an ATSI school, which means they get additional targeted support. Both of those categories require us to be monitored by ADE. And right now, currently, we do that with the help of Project Momentum. And we have ADE coaches come in and work with the district, as well as we have coaches, principal coaches with our schools. The last category is comprehensive. So instead of looking at just a subgroup, they're looking at the school as a whole. For high schools, that might mean they're looking at their dropout rate over 3 years, their graduation rate over 3 years, or they can look at what is their overall school improvement, like how many are the proficiency and growth of all students, not just targeted. So that could be one way to be identified as a CSI. However, if a TSI or an ATSI school after 3 years has not had improvement, they then become a CSI school, which means they're saying instead of maybe just one area, they're looking at the school processes. Maybe they need help outside of just how they're addressing those needs. So we currently have schools that are in the ATSI range, and we do have 3 schools that are CSI, 2 for the high school that are for graduation dropout rate, and then we have our ATSI schools are all for students with disabilities. Yes?
Can you explain stagnation and how it applies? Like, is that only if there's already an area that has been identified that is a warning or needs to improve? Or is it like, hey, I'm doing a great job, but I'm not seeing growth, and therefore it counts as stagnation?
That's a very good question, and they just addressed it this past year. So it used to be a big surprise. We were just given a letter from ADE said, these are your TSI or ATSI schools. And so we weren't given that information of how it's progressed. They have updated their accountability website that we can give administrators access to. And we do have a couple of our schools that now they call it warning. So they're letting you know, hey, you know, if things don't change, you might find yourself in federal improvement. So they are giving us reports showing the trend rate of chronic absenteeism in every one of our subgroups in special education, EL, and low income. And you can look at all kinds of graphs to kind of help schools use that in their PLC meetings as well to say maybe, hey, maybe let's take a look at this. But the stagnation they're looking at, it's very specific from one assessment year to the other, and it's strictly the Azella and the AASA, and then they'll pull in the records that we send in with Synergy for our attendance. And that's all they use. They don't use the CCIR points or anything like that.
So how are they defining chronic absenteeism?
Anything over 10% of the school day.
Okay.
or the school year, sorry, not the day.
Yeah.
Well, then everyone has chronic absenteeism. It's
Which is
anything
what-
over
which is-
10% of the school, their assigned school year. They quit going by days because everyone has such a different calendar and see minutes. So.
And 10% is the statutory limit.
Okay. And I know I should know this, but I don't. Is there anything that goes into the school letter grades besides the standardized testing?
There are quite a few things that go into the letter grade, but it all depends on like the school. Like the high school is a very, very heavy in the CCRI. For the elementary schools and K-8, they do look at attendance. They're looking at how many students pass, that you get certain bonus points on how they do with science. They get bonus points on how many students tested proficient in EL on that Azella. They're looking at, what else do they have on that letter grade? The biggest portions of it, it's growth.
I believe
is majority of it.
I sent an email that kind of outlines that.
We can get that. We can give you another one.
I'm wondering if they look at anything like student to teacher ratio, number of teachers
No.
with
No.
advanced degrees,
No.
anything
No.
like that. Okay.
Additional workouts, I know that would be high school. You can pull some of that work that we do towards planning for the military. There's additional placement tests you could take that give you bonus points in the CCRI, that's College Career Readiness Indicator, but not at the K-8 level.
Thank you.
So we've mentioned professional learning communities several times. This is a very widely researched strategy that is both ESSA, has ESSA evidence that supports the implementation of professional learning communities because it leads to student growth and mastery of standards. Basically what professional learning communities are teachers that share a common subject or a common group of students that are looking at data and working together to identify the root cause of why the data is the way it is and identify strategies to improve whatever data that they're looking at. Or maybe it needs to be decreased if we're talking about behavior issues. Maybe they're talking about strategies for decreasing behavior. Like I said, there's a wide body of research, and if you do research on professional learning communities for fun, you'll hear the name Rick Dufour, who is, there's 4 questions that guide the professional learning community, and the first question is, what do we want students to learn? So that would be the state standards. How will we know that they learned it? And those are the assessments. What will we do if students don't respond to or didn't master that standard? And what will we do if they do master the standard? So the part about not mastering the standard, that is that RTI framework, the tier 2 and tier 3 instruction. And then if they do master the standard, that's when we push students for more enrichment. So those are the typical questions that a professional learning community will be discussing. When we asked school leaders to answer this question about how they're implementing professional learning communities, this is a summary of their responses. So the people who meet are a combination of administrators and instructional coaches, so they could be having their own professional learning community, but then they will also join teacher teams to be part of those discussions. Special education meets in PLCs, and then there will also be PLCs that meet vertically, so it could be a K1-2 group, a 2, 3, 4, etc. Or it could be a group of, at the middle school level, a group of teachers that are reading math, science, and social studies that all share the same students. So it kind of, whatever is going to serve the school's goals is how they'll group their teachers in PLCs. The logistics of them are that schools are meeting in PLCs either bi-weekly or monthly, and they are guided by agendas and protocols. So you do have a copy of KUSD's Professional Learning Communities Guide. This is a district resource for educators. I don't know, Dr. Dora, if you'd like to talk about this. This is a training that all educators have received in KUSD, or at least we definitely school leaders.
We do need to update it.
Have been trained on the professional learning communities expectations, and you'll see that the description of it, the roles and expectations. You'll see that I'm looking on page 4, that start on time, end on time, have an agenda that you stick to. So that way it's really focusing on the data and not any extraneous information. A lot of times, most of the time, people should come prepared for the meeting. So they should have already pulled their data and are aware of what they're bringing to the meeting to share. And then follow the inquiry process. So ask questions, why. Don't stop at just one level of why. Continue to ask why about why the data is the way it is. And trust is a huge piece of the professional learning community, because in order to be able to work together as a team and take suggestions from each other, it's really got to be a process built in trust, that you can trust your teammates that are working together. You'll see the 4-do-4 questions in here on page 5, and some suggestions of what would happen in those discussions for each of the questions, and some characteristics of a KUSD PLC, and then occasionally there will be an observation, so somebody would come and watch and just see how the implementation is going. Back to the survey from school leaders, the data that is used is formative assessments, benchmark assessments, and then in iReady there's standards mastery and progress monitoring assessments that will be pulled. And then the decisions that are made would be what's happening with reteach and enrich. So that the RTI times or the win times or whatever, however they're meeting students' needs based on the skills that they've demonstrated they need or additional help with. Intervention grouping, and then also instructional strategies and pacing, so it can help with actual tier 1 instruction, that if teachers are seeing the whole group missed the standard, we need to go back and reteach the whole thing to the whole class instead of just a small group of students. So again, this is how we use PLCs to make sure that we're focused on standards-based data and implementing strategies to help students master standards.
So I'm just gonna kind of button it up by, oh, do you have a question? Go.
So are all teachers required to be a part of at least one PLC?
Yes.
And then, when are they required to attend said PLC? Are they getting like during classroom time, during their break?
Most campuses make sure there's a common planning time. For example, a Wallapai school, a couple of the other schools where there are 5 teachers on a grade level, in order for them to have a common planning time that isn't too early or too late, we needed to add a 5th special into their rotation. I know that at the middle schools, you guys build your schedule so that there's a time for them to meet. So it's not during instruction time. And it's not really early in the morning or late after. There's not actually contracted hours because we're exempt employees, but to respect time, not past the hour past school.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what about our teachers that are not teaching in a tested subject area?
Well, the high schools and middle schools, and you guys can speak for yourselves, but they, well, why don't you go ahead and do that? Talk about, just briefly, Christina and or Jerusha, how do you include all teachers on a team?
My teachers are involved in like 2 different types of PLCs. One PLC is a department where they're focused on their content areas. So science and social studies will meet together, math and ELA, and SPED will also meet. And then there are team PLCs, and then they will meet then as the team. So the teachers that share those 120 kids will meet then. So then that will be the like 1 math, 1 science, 1 social studies, 1 science teacher will meet as a team. And then like electives or SPED teachers may join in given whatever the topic on the agenda is.
What about your elective area teachers,
Yeah,
the
that's
teachers who don't teach core?
That's what she
Well,
said.
that would be the
Okay.
department. So like they'll meet as a department, they'll meet as a team, and then they'll join in on a team PLC.
Is it similar at the high school, Principal Hannah?
It is.
So elective and CTE teachers participate in PLCs talking about best practices and how the students are progressing. And honestly, every teacher impacts learning, whether it's a specific content area or not. You being a former music teacher, you know that your instruction impact growth as much as the content teacher area.
Yeah, being on an island on a campus makes it difficult to have a professional learning community. You know, when you're the only person teaching a subject on a campus, it's
And I'm
hard.
wondering, like, did you ever meet with the middle school math, like music teachers? And,
Only if we were planning a specific event.
oh, okay.
And this year I have actually attended a music PLC at the beginning of the school year, which was district-wide, so that is something that is happening, I believe, quarterly for music teachers.
So we're excited to share. I know a lot of this was a review, but there's always ahas and circle back learning. President Henry and I'll talk about my board report in a minute, attended ASP, but it was really exciting and interesting to hear the academic focus that a lot of boards and superintendents and teams are having. And I think we're both interested in upping the academic report game. Prior boards, it wasn't as desired to hear it all, but we would like you to know where we're headed for the DeFore questions, how we're doing on the way, what we're doing about it if we're not, and then what we're doing about it if we are. And I did share with you right before break, which feels like a million years ago now, the letter grade data and how the points were earned. And we're going to start giving you quarterly reports on the benchmarks. But while benchmarks and summatives are super important, and we will share that because it measures our journey, we always want to reiterate that teacher in the classroom, whatever type of classroom it is, and those formative assessments, and that relationship in that classroom, that's the most important part. And there's a lot of great things, so we'll highlight that as well. All right.
That's it.
That's it.
Unless there's any other questions.
You can close and transition into the next meeting, unless you have questions, yeah.
If there's no other questions, then is there a motion to adjourn this governing board workshop?
I'll move to adjourn.
Second. All in favor? All right. Meeting adjourned. All right, so we're going to give IT 45 minutes to reset. 45 minutes? 4 to 5.